Hi, Future Selena popping in to just let you know this will be my last Saturday video, and last week's Thursday video will be my last Thursday video. My schedule is going to be changing. I forgot to say this when I was filming beforehand, and so I just wanted to let you know that as I go back to school, I'm going to be posting on Tuesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Sundays will be dedicated to reviews, and Mondays and Fridays will be dedicated to other videos. There's a lot of cool stuff coming. I'm not going anywhere, so just wanted to let you guys know about that minor schedule change. And that's it. Now let's get back into the video. Hi, I'm Selena, and today we're going to talk about my favorite fantasy standalones. Well, SFF standalones. So basically, I wanted to do videos on my favorite series and my favorite standalones. But as I was making my standalones list, I found it really hard because a lot of my favorite standalones are non-fantasy books, but I have so many fantasy standalones that I love and want to talk about. And so I just decided to split up the videos to my favorite SFF standalones and my favorite non-SFF books in general. And because most of what I talk about is SFF, and a lot of my favorites are gonna be sci-fi or fantasy because I love those genres so much. And so I wanted to be able to highlight more books that I love that aren't those, but also highlight the ones that I love and that are sci-fi fantasy. And so I have 15 to talk about, but the first 5 are going to be sort of like honorable mentions because I don't think I love these quite as much as the top 10, but you know, this list could change varying on day to day, so let's just get into it. So number 15 on this list, just briefly, is Heartless by Marissa Meyer. I haven't read this in a long time, but when I read it, I was shocked with how much I loved it. It was 5 stars. It was amazing. This is a origin story for the Queen of Hearts, and what I loved about this book was how well it took the Alice's Adventures in Wonderland world and the illogic of it and the world building of it and made it something unique and gave it reasons, and like it just made it a little bit more logical. It gave you a bit more explanation for why things are the way they are and how things got the way they are. Because Alice, I think part of the point is to not explain it, and I wouldn't have liked it if it tried to like make Alice boring, but in my opinion it didn't. And I also really enjoyed the main story and the characters, and yeah, it was really good in my opinion, but it won't be for everyone. So my next honorable mention is Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson. This one was really fun, and yeah, looking back, I have some issues plot-wise with it, but I still gave it 4.5 stars. I really enjoyed this one. This is the tale of, very simply, 2 sisters where one of them is sent off to marry the God King in the other sister's place, and so the sister that was supposed to go but didn't takes off after her. It has very typical YA tropes, but does them in a very different way, and it is an adult book, so things get very complex, things get a little bit heartbreaking, but they also get very light and happy at times. It just is a really good balance and a really good and fun book to read. The next honorable mention is Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shauna McGuire. So technically this isn't a standalone, this is the second in a series, but each book sort of stands on its own, especially these, some of the books in it are just backstories for some of the characters, and this I think is the best book in the series. It is the backstory for some characters that we meet in book 1, and we do learn about them, but you get to rewind and see it in this one. But you could read this just as a standalone and not read the rest of the series, and so that's why I'm including it. I think it deserves to be talked about because I do love it, even though I have like some minor gripes with it. We basically follow 2 sisters as they go into their own personal magical world, which is kind of a very dark gothic place that kind of has vibes of like Dracula and Frankenstein, and they both take very different paths, and both paths can get pretty dark. And I just really loved this book. It was quite dark for a YA, and it also explored sister relationships that are more than like happy sibling relationships. Like this really explores a very complex one. Number 12 is Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This is my favorite standalone by Brandon Sanderson that he has written. This is a story about a city of the gods which has now gone into ruin. The spell that used to turn people into gods now turns them into zombies, and so we have a bunch of zombies wandering the city, and the city is just kind of left to rot and just fester with all these people in it. And things start changing when the crown prince of the area around Elantris, around this godly city, actually is taken by the magic, the Sheod, and becomes an Elantrian and becomes kind of zombie-like. And so he is thrust into that world and makes some big changes. We also follow some other characters, the most important of which is the betrothed of that prince, Prince Raoden's betrothed, Serene. She arrives in Kai, his city, to find that Raiden is being pronounced dead. And so she has to stay there and sort of politic on her own. And so we followed both of their perspectives, and this was just such a fun book. The first part was a little rough, but I got so connected to these characters, and in the end just loved this book. The final honorable mention is The Changeling by Victor Laval. I love this book. This is kind of an adult dark fantasy. I've described it as like Neil Gaiman, like The Ocean at the End of the Lane vibes meets The Pet Sematary, because it explores a lot of similar themes to Pet Sematary, like parenthood and grief and things like that. We basically follow these parents, Apollo and Emma, and they have a child, but when tragedy befalls their family and Apollo's wife makes decisions he didn't think her capable of making, it sends their family down a really dark path. And it's a dark fantasy, but I don't want to say any more because you really just need to go into this book not knowing too much. It is quite literary for a fantasy, but I think that it is so good. Now for the official top 10. Number 10 on this list, I like a similar amount to The Changeling, but I used to, if you'd asked me this in the summer, I would have put this book a lot higher when I first read it. So I'm putting it at number 10 for now. And that book is The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu. I don't know why I forgot her name. This is kind of a historical fantasy with very low fantasy elements. People have called it magical realism. I don't really know if I would call it that. Think like Peter Pan fairy tale vibes, but like darker a little bit. We also follow another sibling relationship in this. Can you tell I like sibling relationships in my fantasy? We follow a brother and a sister. The brother is actually Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and we follow his older sister Nannerl, who is just as talented as him, but is not going to have the same opportunities as him because she's a woman. And we basically follow their relationship as they're dealing with that, but also as they start having dealings with the Kingdom of Back, which is this sort of fantasy world that has sort of come into their lives, and we follow them as they get involved with this kind of fae creature named Hyacinth, and he basically gives them quests and tasks in their dreams, and we follow them as they grow up and as their relationship changes, as their relationship to the Kingdom of Back changes with it, and it's just really good. I loved this book. It was everything that I wanted at the time. I couldn't even ask for a better book, or I couldn't have even asked for a better book. I think that my love for it has dwindled slightly, but I still consider it one of my favorites. It's such a good fantasy standalone. If you like low fantasy, if you like Peter Pan or like things with that sort of vibes, highly recommend Kingdom of Back. Number 9 on the list is A Curse so Dark and Lonely by Bridget Kemmerer. So this is actually also part of a series. It's the first one in the series, but I think it works as a standalone, and I'm about to read the third one in the series, but I didn't like where the series went, and it honestly went in a very different direction from this first book, and so I honestly sort of anticipate treating this book as a standalone. And this was such a great contained story. It's a Beauty and the Beast retelling. We follow this girl named Harper who is taken into this other realm to basically aid the prince of this realm into getting a curse off of his realm. And it was so fun. It was so good. I was on board with the romance. I was on board with the characters. I love the main character, Harper. She's so fun to read from. I enjoyed the dynamics of Harper and the prince who she is supposed to help save. I love the dynamics between the bodyguard of the prince and the bodyguard and Harper. They just have like such a great dynamic. I love the dynamics of the villain with the prince, and it was so good. It was so fun. It had such high stakes to me. It was so good for a contained Beauty and the Beast retelling. Once it got a little less contained, I like the series a little bit less, so that's probably why it's so low, and also because it's not really a standalone, but I sort of want to treat it like a standalone because it's so good as a standalone. There's just like one part at the end that makes this a series. Like we could have stopped here and it would have been worth it. The next book on this list is one of the only sci-fi books on this list, and it actually is part of a series, but again, it works as a standalone. I've only read this book in the series, and that book is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. So this is kind of a comic, absurdist sci-fi. How to describe the plot? I don't know. Basically, we start following this earthener called Arthur Dent on Earth's demolition day, and Arthur escapes and hitches a ride with a bunch of space criminals, kind of. the president of of some galaxy that has kind of taken a ship and fled. I don't know, it's hard to describe the plot of this because it is so good, but the reason people love this book so much is because of how it's delivered. The humor of it, the commentary of it, just this book is so well crafted. And just it's also just really fun. And I read this for the first time when I was 13, loved it then, reread it a couple of years ago, loved it then. And it's one of my favorite sci-fi books. And I'm cheating yet again because for number 7, I'm actually going to talk about 2 books in one, and they're both of Neil Gaiman's middle grade books, or like children's books. So we have Coraline and we have The Graveyard Book. And I love these 2 books. They don't go together at all, like they're both standalones. But I wanted to talk them together because I wanted to talk about them both, but I didn't want to take like so many slots up for Gaiman, because spoiler alert, these aren't the only Gaimans on the list. But these books are both just so good. They're both short, sweet, amazing reads. Coraline is the story of a girl who finds a door in her house, and it leads to a new house with new parents with buttons for eyes. And the first things seem okay, but she quickly realizes that it's actually more of a sinister version of her life, and she has to figure out how to get back and how to navigate that. Yeah. It's really fun, really short, kind of like light creepy. It's not really like scary, but like it has like good vibes. And then The Graveyard Book, in my opinion, is even less scary. It's really more of a book about a kid being raised by ghosts who basically just like love him as their own. It's a retelling of the Jungle Book, and it's kind of episodic in nature. Like each chapter is like a different sort of story about him growing up. I loved this book. I thought it was so heartwarming. It really felt like a Disney movie within a book for me, and I don't know, both of these books, I think Coraline has an adaptation that I've heard is great. Graveyard Book could have an adaptation so easily, and it would be so good. I love these books so much. Number 6 is a relatively new read, and that is An Unkindness of Magicians by Kat Howard. So this is the only urban fantasy, I think, on this list, and it's probably the urban fantasy, it's my favorite urban fantasy. And it's basically this story about these magicians that live in New York. They live in the unseen world, which is just New York, but their leg of New York. And every 30 years, I think, there's house wars, and the winner of the house wars controls the unseen world for the next 20, 30 years, something like that. And we follow a girl named Sydney who does not belong to a house but is insanely powerful and wants to make some big changes in the world. But to do that, she has to win the house wars with a lot of people who are just as talented and willing to play dirty. We follow a lot of perspectives though. We kind of switch back and forth, but this is very like plot driven, so we're not getting like a deep look into every perspective. It's just to like give you more sides of the plot. But I really, really love this. I think it's such a good, like fast-paced, quick standalone. If you're a plot-driven reader, if you like plot, if you like fun, fast-paced plots, this is so good. If you're looking for more like character work like Stormlight Archive level, this is probably gonna disappoint you a little bit, but I was not disappointed at all because I loved this plot so much. And it got way darker than I was expecting. It goes places I was not expecting. Thought it was great. We are finally at my top 5 favorite fantasy standalones, and my number 5 is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. So this is a beautiful, whimsical, is that a word? I think it is. Oh my gosh. That's embarrassing. Basically, it's a book full of whimsy. We follow this town called Wall, which beyond the wall is the land of fairy. It's kind of it's built on the border of the land of fairy. And the citizens of Wall don't really mingle with the fairy world until one day of the year when there's a fairy market. And at this market, a very special child is conceived. We follow this child as he later in life is trying to win a wife, like get a girl to marry him, and this girl that he's interested in promises to marry him if he can catch the falling star that has fallen from the sky and landed in fairy. And so he sets off to find this fallen star, but he's not the only one. There's other people who want this star as well, and it is so good. This book showed me like just what Neil Gaiman's abilities with plot and world and atmosphere were, because this book feels so good. It's like an adult fairy tale. It's so nice to read, but it also has such an intricate plot. Like there's so many different perspectives that all want the star for different reasons. This plot is so intricately put together, and it is so fun. And the characters I thought were really, really fun too. And its ending was so good. I really loved this book. I need to reread it because this is one of the ones that I read a long time ago, and it's honestly the thing that made me like love Neil Gaiman and want to read all of his work. So I need to reread this and see how it stacks up now. Number 4 on this list is another new read, but it was so good. And that book is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is just a really sweet contemporary fantasy where the fantasy aspects are definitely there, but they are more like, it's not like a big like epic quest or anything. Like, this is just a very contained like family story where the magic aspects are used to make points and like execute the story in a fun way. We basically follow a caseworker that checks out magical children. Like, he makes sure that the houses they're staying in are up to code basically, and he visits one house with some high profile kids that are sort of volatile, and he is meant to basically see how they're doing, what's going on there, and we basically just follow him getting there and seeing this amazing family, meeting these amazing kids, and just trying to figure out what he wants in life, because he's in a place where he was sort of in a rut, and then he meets these amazing people and sees this amazing family, and that sort of gives him a taste of what he would want in life. We just see Linus slowly fall in love with the place. We see him learn to love the kids and appreciate them for who they are, and we see him have a romance, and we see him really learn to value himself more. And it's really such a sweet, amazing story. It plays with some of my favorite tropes, such as like the kids who are like kind of the big bads, or could be a big bad one day, but because of how they're raised or how their circumstances, they're like not what people think they are. And like magical children, I love them, but like these are like straight up like magical beings. Like, a lot of them aren't human, and I love that. I eat that stuff up. And then there's so many themes of acceptance, and the acceptance of the world versus the acceptance of yourself, and acceptance from like people who love you, and how even if the world doesn't accept you, there will always be people who will see you and know you for you. It just has so many good themes, and I love this book. It's number 4 on my list. So number 3 is a dark fantasy horror suspense book. Hey, horror and fantasy are very close together, so I'm going to say I'm going to put this on the SFF list, and especially because like this is a very like more fantastical horror rather than like a more realistic horror, or even like a more like horrific horror. Like, it is very like dark fantasy and really leans into those aspects, especially with the ending. And that book is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. I love this book. This is such a great book. It reminded me of like the Jurassic Park movie. We basically follow a group of scientists and different people with different talents with like water-based talents. We follow some journalists. We follow some people who've been studying Mariana Trench, studying different creatures of the deep, some divers. We follow a lot of different people, and we get to know them all as they are on this boat heading towards the Mariana Trench to find mermaids. And they find them, and they are brutal. They are killing machines. They are out for blood. And it is really kind of a classic Crichton-like commentary on like how humans can't let anything be and like to be like the biggest and baddest things in the world, but what if they're not? And the hubris of people, and it's just so good. But it does all that in a very human way. Like, each character is very much well developed, especially in the beginning. We spend a lot of time just living with these characters, finding out their motivations, finding out why they want to be on this cruise, finding out what stakes they have in this, and I was very compelled by that. It made me know the characters so much more when things really started to get going. And even like the science-y parts of it, especially in the beginning or in the middle where we were talking about like the science of it, I was still so fascinated. I just was so fascinated by this book, and I read it so quickly for like kind of a thick-ish book. It's just so engaging and so good, so character driven, but also with an amazing plot, with such a horrific and like dark plot. Oh, it was so good. And the suspense that this book brings out in you, it's just so good. It's my number 3. It could even be number 2. I don't know. I love this book so much. Number 2 right now is really tentative for me to say because I did just read this book, and that is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. I love this book. I didn't expect it to be my number 2, but as I was going through the list, I was like, oh shoot, maybe it is my number 2. I don't know. But anyways, I love it. Either way, I have a whole review for this, so I don't want to go on about it, and I will link that review. The review is for 3 separate books, but it has timestamps, and Spinning Silver is the first one I talk about. I love it. If you want more of a spoiler-free like in-depth discussion of this book, then I will link that. Basically, I called it an extended fairy tale. It's a Rumpelstiltskin inspired, at least in one point of view. We follow 3 different women, and their perspectives do link up in the most like magical and fairy tale-esque ways, but like a dark fairy tale. Like, this isn't a fairy tale with no stakes. It's basically about how the women of these situations all end up in really hard situations and use their wits and things to sort of save themselves and get themselves out of those situations, and or just save themselves in some small way. And I really, really, really loved this book. It was so engaging. The magic in this was like, so good. He is not gonna put this vacuum on right now. Where was I? I had to stop filming because my dad decides to vacuum every single time I film. But where was I? I think I was talking about the magic. I love the magic of this. It was so beautiful and just like whimsical. Pretty much everything I want from magic, like fairy tale magic, it was in this book. Like, I can't even describe to you how much like this book and the magic like spoke to me. Like, this is like, every time I was reading, I was like, yes, this is the fantasy I've always wanted. And then the characters are just so good. This is also very similar to Into the Drowning Deep. We have this kind of a slow start where we get to know the characters really well, but then the plot never like picks up, but it does, things start happening a little bit more. And by the time things are happening, we already know these characters so well, and the world just sort of expands a bit, and it's just so good. Go check out my review if you want some more non-spoiler thoughts on this, but it was so good that it made it to my second favorite fantasy standalone. I don't know. I just think it accomplished so much that was so good in this book. And then we've made it to my number 1 favorite fantasy standalone. And this, when I read it, I put it at the top, even though I read it quite a while ago, because I don't think there's another answer that could be at the top of this list. Like, when I read this book, I was so profoundly like moved and like struck by it, and just I was so affected by it. And it is an emotional book, but it's also kind of dark and a little bit light horror-y, and I love that stuff. And it was just, my love for it just really crept up on me. And for a while after that, I was like, is this my favorite book? Like, this might be my new favorite book. And it is definitely my favorite fantasy, like, standalone. And so that's why it's at the top of this list. There's really not another answer I could say here, but the book I'm going to say is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This is my favorite of the Neil Gaiman books I've read so far. It is so, so good. It is this story about a man who comes back to the town he grew up in, and you're sort of thrown back into his memories that he starts remembering that are triggered by him coming to this town, they're quite traumatic memories about a threat to his safety when he was a child, that was sort of supernatural in origin, and you get to see him navigate that with his best friend who lived down the road, and you see what childhood horrors this child sort of went through. And it's there will be trigger warnings, but it's really not as horrific as like I'm sort of making it sound now. Like, it is very like fantasy horror stuff. Like, this is very dark fantasy. Like, it's not really heavy horror. It's like light horror, dark fantasy, surrealist is probably the 3 genres it falls into best. Low fantasy. And this book is told in such an interesting way. We are in the head of the main character, so both when he's an adult and then we are thrown back into his head when he's a child. And we never know his name. We just sort of get his perspective, and we are very close inside his mind, but again, we never know his name. I don't think, at least. Maybe it said it somewhere in here, but I really think that this book is told without a name been given to him. And we just, again, like I said with Spinning Silver, the magic in this book, the fantastical elements of this book, the darkness of this book, just spoke to me in such a deep and like meaningful way. Like, it was everything I wanted and didn't even know I wanted. Like, my love for this book really crept up on me when I was reading it. I was liking it, enjoying it, was disturbed by it at times, and then all of a sudden I just loved it so hard and couldn't recommend it enough to everyone in my life. It's so short. You could read it really quickly if it sounds like your thing. I love this book. It was so good, and it remains my favorite. I display it on my shelves. As you can see, this whole shelf is like destroyed now because all those books. But I love The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and I hope that I will always love it. It may not always be my number 1, but I hope I will always love it. Well, there you have it. That was my top 15 favorite fantasy standalones, or SFF standalones. Thank you for watching this video. Let me know what you thought of my favorites, and let me know what your favorites are. Let me know if we share any favorites in the comments down below, and I will see you next time. Bye.